Hello, I am Watanabe Mayu, President of JFIR. We have a public seminar today. The theme is to have voices for maritime stability, navigation of freedom and territorial integrity. I solicit your cooperation. The non-humanitarian attack is being waged by Russia in terms of Russia's aggression against Ukraine, and this is a blatant violation of international law. Despite that, there is an international law and international regime, but there is no way to stop the war at this time. That is a hard reality we are faced with. Post-war period, we had said that we will never accept unilateral changes to the status quo by force, but it's being shaken. Eurasia, where Europe resides, is faced with the issue, and also the Indo-Pacific, where Japan belongs in terms of ocean and maritime affairs, is also faced with great challenges. Likewise, maritime buildup is very strong on the part of China, and the central line between China and others are being adhered to or sometimes not adhered to, be it the South China Sea or East China Sea. There are certain threatening activities seen, which is an attempt to unilaterally change the status quo by force, and that is a very regrettable thing. So, to whom the ocean belongs, this is an old and new theme. We would like to seek how to stabilize the maritime affairs and ocean. That is the topic for our discussion today. There are so many issues pertaining to ocean surrounding Japan, and we like to share the notion throughout the world, both at home and abroad. Outcome of today's discussion will be transmitted widely after this. In the order of a presentation, I would like to introduce to you the speakers. Please show your face when introduced. We have a distinguished research fellow, Professor Ito Go from JFIR, and under the chairmanship of Professor Ito Go, we have dealt with a long time issues pertaining to maritime affairs. To whom ocean belongs has been the persistent theme. The assertion is getting greater on the part of China. No nation is able to effectively address this issue. How to go about it, we would like to find a hint to solving the issue. For the past few years, we were taking the approach how to build an opinion around maritime stability. In 2016, in the South China Sea, about the 9-line, the China's conduct have been decided as a lawful by the arbitration tribunal of maritime affairs under UNCLOS. Nice to have you, Professor Go. And from Vietnam, we have Nguyen Thi Lang An, Director of Research Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam. And also we have Mr. Komori Yuta, Senior Fellow, Ocean Policy Research Institute, Sasakawa Peace Foundation. And from the United States, we have Virginia Watson, Professor, the Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies. And we have Professor Yamada Yoshihiko, Professor, Tokai University. And from Singapore, Senior Fellow John Bradford, Rajaratnam School of International Studies, RSIS. And from Canada, we have Miss Professor Stephen Nagy, International Christian University. Nice to have you all. Thank you. I wish for the most productive meeting today. Now, without any ado, I hand over the microphone to Professor Ito, please.
Hello, everybody. This is the conference about the maritime security. I intentionally entitled this conference Maritime Order, Resilience, and Stability. The reason for naming the conference in that way was that there are two parts of the conference. The first is a closed session, which was conducted the day before yesterday. And the open symposium is actually the fact that we are going to have that from now. In terms of the substance of discussion, which was conducted the day before yesterday, we divided the argument into two sessions. One is a maritime order, which is actually at crisis because of the China's gradual assertiveness, and also, well, even though China received a ruling from the Permanent Court of Arbitration 7 years ago in the year 2016, July 12, regarding the unlawfulness of the Nine-Dash Line in the South China Sea. But China called it as a garbage and has been trying to continue its reclamation and also militarization. So that actually means that China has been trying to change the status quo or status, the current situation, the order, by force. China has been thinking that the current international order led by the United States can be seen as unsatisfactory. The reason is that the entire, establishment of a liberal order that has been lasted until today can be seen as unsatisfactory for the Chinese. So because of that, China has been trying to change the status quo. In that sense, for us, the status quo is right now at risk. So we discussed this issue of the Chinese assertiveness in the closed session. And also another topic of the closed session was our possible countermeasures against the Chinese gradual expansion. I call that in amoeba type of the foreign behaviors, which means that unless we conduct a deterrence against them, they tend to expand their influences. So that means that we cannot make any kind of the international political vacuum. Once the vacuum is made, there's a higher possibility that China would be get in to get a hold of that political vacuum under its influence. So because of this reason, well, the second session of the closed session yesterday, we discussed the possible countermeasures against the Chinese expansion. Of course, there is established framework of the international law. United Nations, the Convention on the Sea, UNCLOS, is a typical example. But of course, a rule-based international order is of course nothing wrong. But the problem is that we usually tend to see that China, you cannot do that, you cannot do that. So then we continue to say that China cannot do that. But even ever since the July 2016 award, what has changed? Well, my understanding is that nothing has changed. Chinese progressive, reclamation and the militarization still continues. So because of that, well, we have to think about the various kinds of countermeasures, beyond the international law and UNCLOS framework. So that's the second topic we discussed on the 8th of March. Based upon that, two different kinds of the topics for the closed session. Today is the open public symposium regarding how we able to make and maintain the stability of the maritime order. We usually tend to think that, of course, that there's various kinds of tensions between a rising power and and also the rest of the country who would like to maintain the status quo. Of course, China tends to think that the current maritime order is unsatisfactory for China. So that's the reason why it would like to change the status quo. But this kind of tension did not occur quite recently. Of course, the traditional tension has been that between the coastal countries that would like to take a look at the ocean as a part of the territory and would like to expand its power over that oceans. and the inland countries that usually doesn't have any kind of oceans, which usually tend to expand the publicness and the openness of the oceans. So that means that our conception of the high sea, and that actually means that all the countries would like to make use of that actually, the ocean as public good. Actually started as claim of the inland countries who would like to emphasize the publicness of the oceans. So this is the pretty old problem, but actually this kind of tensions, of course old, but it can be also a new problem. So the purpose of this this symposium is that there should be a various kinds of tensions, between the the country who would like to change the status quo and the countries who would like to maintain the status quo. So there's a variety of speakers from the 6 different countries who would like to speak about the their own positions and also ideas about the the different vectors between the territorial integrity and the the freedom of navigation. Freedom of navigation, of course, the idea that they would like to make use of the ocean as a public sea, and would like to make the the public areas as wide as possible. And territorial integrity is the ideas of the trying to expand the ideas of the sovereignty, not just within the territory, not just within land, but also over the ocean areas. So, this kind of opposite and also extreme directions of the vectors, how we can take that they reconcile. So that's the basic topic of this open symposium. We have the 6 speakers. The first actually from Vietnam, and also second from second from the United States, from Hawaii, which is actually right now 9 o'clock in the evening, and Vietnam is right now 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And the 2 speakers from Japan, and also one from Canada, but actually, the Nagi-san is right now staying in Australia. I'm also right now, staying in Australia, so I think both of us met each other actually in the morning. And the other is the John Bradford, who should be actually working in Singapore. I just heard that he's back in Tokyo. But of course, with the different kinds of backgrounds, we'd like to get the different opinions, also, also different ideas together to think about, this, opposite vectors regarding the ideas about the sovereignty and also territorial integrity and the openness of the oceans. So, first, we'd like to invite, the Vietnamese scholar, right now the director of research at the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam. And she is the one of the award, the recipients of the Nakasone Award several years ago, and in fact invite Langham for her 8-minute speech. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Ito. And thank you very much for the Japan Forum on International Relations to invite me to be in the very important forums. So the question that we discussed today is about navigation freedom and territorial integrity. And I just questioned myself, what are the relationship between the two? And of course, from the introduction of the president of the forum, we hear about the current conflict happening in Ukraine. And I would like to quote the statement made by the Prime Minister of Japan, Ishida, last year in the Shangri-La Dialogue, when he mentioned that what happened in Europe today may happen in Asia tomorrow. So what happened in Europe today, we can see clearly the violation of territorial integrity. The practice go against a very basic principle of international law, that the use of force and peaceful settlement of international dispute. So if we think about the theory that what happened in Europe today can happen in Asia tomorrow, then I conduct a review on what we have in Asia nowadays that can lead to any kind of potential conflict in the future. And we have at hand the sovereignty dispute in a number of places in Asia, and according to my scope, I'd like to focus on the dispute in the South China Sea and try to explore the linkage between the dispute in the South China Sea and freedom of navigations. I take the South China Sea because Vietnam is one of the littoral states, and because when you look at the South China Sea, the importance of freedom of navigation is very much clearer to illustrate. So even country far away like Canada, I met with Professor Nagy not long ago when we have a chance to talk about the Indo-Pacific strategy of Canada. And even Canada that far away that still account for very much important interest from the freedom of navigation throughout the South China Sea, let alone the country in the region like Japan, like Australia, like Korea, and many others. And in my written note talking point, I already mentioned about some figures to indicate the importance of the Taiwan Strait and the Malacca Strait, two of the very important navigation routes throughout the South China Sea. So based on that, I will explore that what happened from the territorial dispute and maritime dispute in the South China Sea can produce any kind of hinder impacts towards freedom of navigations. So my argument when going to the examine of the current state practice in the South China Sea that has that linkage to freedom of navigations. And I would like to expand a little bit more about not just about freedom of navigation, but also freedom of overflight. Because nowadays, commercial route, not just about the sea, but also the air, and the sea and the air have interconnected relations. So when I did that examinations, I found a number of practices that hinder the freedom of navigation. Name as a few, we saw the incident happen at sea, like the most recent one is the laser incident between China and Philippine law enforcement forces. And that kind of incident obviously produced negative impact on the safety of navigations. And the laser incident between China and the Philippines is just one of the many incidents that already happened in the South China Sea. The second state practice that I would like to point out is the national legislation. Countries in the regions tend to issue national legislation that to some extent limit the freedom of navigation of the other country. For example, the requirement of prior notice or prior authorizations. Normally under UNCLOS, innocent passage is on the non-discrimination principle and is open for both all types of vessels except for the submarine and the one who run by nuclear power. So by issuing a national legislation that limiting the right of innocent passage is also go against the freedom of navigation. Furthermore, some national legislation also provide the authority of the Coast Guard to use of force and also allow the pilotage into foreign ships. And also, when you come to the scope of application, the wording of water under jurisdiction is vague in the sense that because the dispute exists, so anyone will try to expand their jurisdiction water. So take China as the case, for example, national legislation of China always say in the vague term that national jurisdiction. But as Professor Ito mentioned before, although we have the arbitrary tribunal award that rule out the validity of the 9-dash line, but still the practice of China in the South China Sea indicate that China would believe that national jurisdiction of the country will expand to the whole 9-dash line. So altogether, that the provision of the national legislation will pose a risk for the excessive use of force and will limit the freedom of navigation of the other country in the South China Sea. The third type of state practice is the what we call is a gray zone tactics. The gray zone tactics have quite a number of expression, but I just pick out the recent development from the maritime militia present in the South China Sea. 2 years ago, we have the first time when hundreds of maritime militias gather at the Winston Rift, and that fight were reported by the Philippines and not then covered by the other media as well. And at the moment, if you look at the satellite image, the same situation happened. You will see hundreds of maritime militia present in the South China Sea. And given the very busy maritime sea route or maritime communication connection in the South China Sea, the presence of hundreds of maritime militia version alone also can increase the density and produce impact, negative impact for freedom of navigation. Depends on the location of their presence. The fourth one is I'm going to talk about military drills, and particularly the live fire drills one. It always comes with the notice of limiting the freedom of navigation in certain location at sea, and therefore military drill conducting in the more frequent tendency in the South China Sea, combined with the other vehicle like air draft, also cause a limitation for freedom of navigations. And lastly, the land reclamations, you can see that before the completion of land reclamation in the South China Sea and after the completion of that land reclamation, it seems like land reclamation has been used as outsport to provide logistic arrangement, to provide the habitants for different forces of vessels. They can come back and forth, and therefore increase the tendency that the country can exercise their control over the South China Sea, can provide the coercive activities, as well as a result, it will create favorable conditions for them to continue their illegal activity at sea and obstructing the freedom of navigation and the overflight of the other country. So given all the 5 types of group of activities that produce a hindrance for the freedom of navigation and in the South China Sea, I try to make a conclusion that really in the South China Sea, we are talking about safety of navigation and freedom of navigation, but all the situations that may not really reach the tension that causes the attention of the world, but it's still undercurrent and it's keep going on. And if any type of miscalculation or misunderstanding occur, it may lead to a real conflict. And in that case, if a war occurs, like what happened in Europe, of course, it will lead to conflict at sea. And also from the strategic point of view, if we look at the current tension in Taiwan, the current practice of building, constructing military base in the rim in Cambodia, for example, that 2 ends and nearby the Taiwan Strait and near the Malacca Strait. And if you imagine that if conflict occurs, then of course freedom of navigation will be disrupted. It's not not just hindrance anymore, but disrupted, and serious consequences for global supply chain and free trade of the world will happen. So with that, I can see that from territorial claim and maritime claim in the South China Sea, it leads to excessive maritime activities. It leads to potential use of force, and it leads to the potential miscalculation and real conflict may happen. So from the point of view that current activity can hinder the freedom of navigation, to the possible consequences in the future that if conflict occur in both scenarios, we can see that freedom of navigation currently in the South China Sea is heavily affected in the bad way. So with that, I would like to end my talking points and looking forward for the Q&A section later on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Gang. Well, the domestic, actually, various kinds of domestic projection of power actually into the international area. Of course, depending on the different countries. Well, the different countries usually, tend to emphasize, different kind of things that actually, they might lead to a possible tension, especially, not just the traditional, military power, but also, kind of gray zone, security is also becoming quite significant. So thank you, Langan. Next speaker is Mr. Komori, Sasaka Peace Foundation from Japan. So for 8 minutes, actually, please. 8分間でお願いします。
Thank you. I'm Komori, Ocean Policy Research Institute, Sasakawa Peace Foundation. Do you see my slides? Yes, we see your slides. Thank you, Professor Ito. Thank you for your introduction. I'm Komori, Ocean Policy Research Institute, Sasakawa Peace Foundation. Thank you very much for inviting me to this forum. A cabinet decision is slated to be made this spring on Japan's revised basic plan on ocean policy, and I'll discuss the upcoming plan in the context of stable use of the oceans. As you may know, the cabinet decided on the basic plan on ocean policy in 2008, following the enactment in 2007 of the Basic Act on Ocean Policy. Article 16 of the Basic Act provides that the basic plan shall be reviewed, and necessary changes will be made approximately every 5 years, taking into consideration changes in situations around the oceans and evaluation of the effectiveness of measures related to the oceans. The plan has been revised in 2013 and 2018 according to the provision, and its revision in 2023 will be the third revision. Ocean Policy Research Institute of the Sasakawa Peace Foundation, or OPRI SPF in short, since the days of its predecessor organization, Ocean Policy Research Foundation, has worked with our sister organization, the Japan Foundation, to serve as the secretariat of bipartisan Basic Act on Ocean Policy Research Group, and was deeply engaged in enactment of the Basic Act on Ocean Policy. In addition, our institute has been engaged in the process of cabinet decision on the basic plan on ocean policy based on the Basic Act, and of making the plan as effective as possible. Our achievements have been presented in different fora, both in and outside Japan, some of which have been highly regarded internationally. And again, for the upcoming third revision, our institute conducted a survey in the months of October and December to elucidate features and challenges for the third plan. The questionnaire survey was conducted with approximately 6,000 individuals, including direct members, local government officials, university faculty and staff, executives and employees of research institutions, including independent administrative agencies and national research and development institutions, executives and employees of organizations, including NPOs and NGOs, and private sector executives and employees, of which 352 have given us responses. Some of you in the audience may have responded. Thank you so much. Some of the questions concerned the degree of awareness about the basic plan, but here I'd like to focus on the questions we gave on the measures in Chapter 2 of the basic plan. We asked the questions to evaluate the 9 measures that are in the Chapter 2 of the current basic plan. Many have responded that in addition to number 1, maritime security, number 2, promotion of industrial use of the ocean, and number 3, preservation and conservation of the maritime environment were also important. The detail is shown in the graph on the right. As you know, the current basic plan advocates comprehensive maritime security. The result of the survey suggests that the plan should go beyond security and place more importance on promotion of maritime governance in general, encompassing environmental conservation and economic development. I know I'm rushing through, but taking into consideration the respondents' other feedbacks, it seems that expectations for the next basic plan are considered to be quite high despite some challenges. the PowerPoints are ahead of me, but meanwhile, as you may be aware, and I know some of you may share this concern, the so-called three defense documents, i.e. National Security Strategy, National Defense Strategy, and Defense Build-up Program, decided by the Cabinet back in December, are at the core of Japan's security policies in the coming years. The documents, however, do not refer to the basic plan on ocean policy at all, although it refers to the importance of maritime security. The issue here is that there is no clear linkage between the documents and the basic plan. I am concerned about the situation where Japan's ocean policies and security policies could be implemented in a less integrated manner, as far as these documents are concerned. In contrast, Japan's science, technology, and innovation basic plan and strategic energy plan clearly stipulate their relations with the basic plan on ocean policy. There was no mentioning, however, of the basic plan in the three defense documents. It seems rather odd that there is no mentioning of the basic plan in the three defense documents. My message here is that there should be a careful study on the consistency of the three defense documents and the basic plan on ocean policy in view of Japan's future maritime security. I know that I have rushed through and I've tried to talk about many areas in a very limited time. Let me summarize. I've so far discussed the evaluation and the challenges for the basic plan on ocean policy. For Japan to promote its maritime policies and maritime security in particular, I believe economic development, environmental conservation, and other ocean-related activities should be integrated into the plan. Elizabeth Mann Borghese, who served as the vice chair of the IWCO Independent World Commission on the Oceans, argued for the importance of maritime security by saying UNCLOS and navies are in a state of divorce. There can never be peace at sea without a contribution by sound naval powers. I don't want to sound arrogant, but I hope the challenges I've described will be resolved to establish better maritime security and contribute to the promotion of ocean policies. Now, a piece of advertisement. The entire survey results are available on our institute's website. The URL is on the side. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you. To protect the maritime space and utilization of maritime space, I mean, we have been given too much focus on protecting, defending the maritime space, but we should give more focus on utilization of oceans. And that is the context in which we are discussing this revision of the basic plan.
Currently, she is working for the Center for the Asia-Pacific Center for Security Studies. She's right now in Hawaii right now, 9:30 p.m. So Virginia, well, 8 minutes. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, good evening from here, but good afternoon over there in Japan. First off, thank you to the JFIR for the invitation. To Drs. Watanabe and Drs. Ito, thank you very much for inviting me to this conference. I just have two talking points. The first one is going to talk about the geometries of architecture in the region and how that impacts on the maritime situation particularly in South China Sea and Southeast Asia sub-region. And the second one is on the importance and the role of technology as an imperative, it's an important factor in determining for perhaps the fate of not just the outcome of some of the crisis situations in the region, but also the world order or the international order, as we call it. I have a slide here, and this was made by Dr. Hemming and myself, and in one of our presentations. And this is we crafted just on top of our heads some of the configurations of alliances, partnerships, and so forth that exist in the region, and paying mind to the maritime, more or less some of the maritime alliances and partnerships that we've had so far, and we might have thus far. For example, the United States, Philippines, Australia proposed a partnership on on the Joint Maritime Patrol is very new. And of course, there's AUKUS in there, and we have Quad and so forth. There's been a tendency today, at least in the region, as far as we see it, a privileged position for a caucus or smaller composition of alliances and partnerships across the board. The magic number seems to be between 3 to 5 or 3 to 4 usually countries. And it's been said, and based also on our research, conversations, and actual talking to people, that number is preferred even in maritime organizations to seek alliances outside of the countries, because it's manageable. At the same time, it is also something that is functional based, practical, focus based, and a more efficient use of limited resources. And also it helps towards establish habits of cooperation between these countries. And in some cases, there are opportunities to develop even further, thicker and deeper relationships across the board. Next steps towards, apart from the confidence building measures that happen within their countries. And of course, at the end of it all, it validates the rules-based international order. Lots of advantages here. And I say that this is a response to, for example, China's incursions in the South China Sea. It would be well, because the response of the Southeast Asian region has been through the ASEAN. And for the most part, we know that has achieved very limited results, successful results. It's been delayed. It's been dragged through so many years, and nothing's really come out of it. And there's been suggestion to reduce the numbers, perhaps, to the countries who have the claims, for example, in the South China Sea. And so that is an idea, I think, that is coming out of these geometries of the geopolitics. That is, if it was focused enough, it was functional enough, and it was based on a common interest, a common understanding of what maritime security is among a very small number of countries, perhaps it could happen. They might go somewhere, instead of communiques not being issued because of countries being influenced by some other external parties and the like. So this is just something to consider as far as when you're thinking about how best to promote cooperation, how best to establish a stable region wherein you have a network, not just alliances of the United States, not just bilaterals, because usually bilaterals are, at least as far as we've interviewed people, it's usually between it's a very asymmetric relationship. And then but these numbers are more or less comfortable numbers as far as countries are concerned, and I think it's something to consider as a proposal to move ahead in terms of making the code of conduct a reality on the terms, of course, that are agreed upon. The second point I'd like to make, and I have no slide for that, is on technology. And the imperative of technology is not just true for in the maritime domain, but for all domains. And I just like to pay attention, just focus attention in that, because today we have a lot of talk of the emerging technologies, and in particular the importance of artificial intelligence and cyber as foundational technologies that are critical in the race, of course, for innovation power, but also for countries to really buy into that and to be really part of the action, to be part of the conversation in the development of artificial intelligence and cyber and participation in the cyber domain. As one very famous scholar said, faster airplanes did not help build faster airplanes, but today faster computers will help build faster computers. So the innovation is going to be perpetual, in perpetuum. It is built in. Therein lies the difference of what we have today, is that you have to be a part of the game because you're going to be left behind completely. The innovation is inherent in artificial intelligence and in the cyber domain. And so that is something that needs to be considered by all countries if they were to develop credible defense postures in the maritime domain. One example I can think of, top of my head, is the drones, that how the drones were used by the Ukrainians in tearing down the Russian ships in the supply vessels. The use of drones and the use of, I believe there were only 2 missiles that they've used, each at about $500 million each. And they shot down, they destroyed $650 million Russian ship. And so that is going to be the wave of the future, is really a lot of creativity and innovation, and in the use of technologies, and especially in the maritime domain, where I believe in the Indo-Pacific region, it's going to be the most important theater for conflict and for engagement across the board. And a couple of other things I wanted to highlight before my last point. Technology is does not necessarily have to upend, the international order. I saw at least 3 patterns of interaction between technology, let's say in the maritime domain, and the relationship of countries across the region. The first one is that technology has been used to build and solidify alliances. And so in that sense, they've kept intact and protected and defended the rules-based order. The second one is that the technology has been used also to, in a way, challenge the status quo. Think about North Korea, to sort of upend, if they can, existing norms and rules of the system, but can't do much about that. And the third one is the strategic competition between the Chinese and the Americans today, which I believe is something beyond just really new advances in new weapons and new technology, but rather transformative, maybe perhaps introducing new organizing principles in the modern state system. And that is revolutionary in scope and in its nature, and the technology is going to have it's going to figure very importantly in that, especially artificial intelligence, which has been identified by these 2 countries as the most determinative, the most transformative in terms of the balance of power, in terms of the future of the world, in terms of the international order. The final 2 points I'd like to make, not maybe super related to this. I've also noticed one development outside of the Indo-Pacific region that perhaps something that can also be considered in the region is diplomacy. The rise of diplomat technologists, or so to speak, and it started in the Scandinavians, and that's picked up quite a bit. The diplomacy for in the realm of technology, and that is something that is worth looking at. And of course, internally, if the maritime domain is as important as we think it is, and we recognize that it is, countries who have strong maritime presence or maritime interests ought to consider that their chiefs of staff ought to be maybe considered not just from the Army, but also from the Navy. A lot of the nations who have maritime interests still have the chief of the Army as the heads of their commanding generals, for example. And it's something that's worth considering in light of the fact that the maritime domain is a very important domain of conflict and engagement in the future. And that's all I have, Gosang. Thank you very much for your kind attention. And the last thing I'd like to say is, of course, everything I said here is just mine and mine alone, and they do not represent the APCSS nor the Department of Defense, the United States, and the United States government. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Virginia. Well, she emphasizes kind of the impact of technology in the maritime domain. Well, especially the areas at the kind of distance like too far. So I think that technology is also playing a very significant role. So I think about the next turn is Professor Yamada Yoshihiko Sensei, at Tokai University, very renowned actually specialist on this in maritime security. So I think 8 minutes. Yamada Sensei.
はい、山田でございます。
Hello, I am Yamada. Nice to meet you all. Thank you for having me. Together with Dr. Ito, For a long time, literally over a long time, I have worked with him. In thinking about maritime security, most realistic approach has been taken by Professor Ito and myself. So one of the outcomes is that I'm a field worker. I always work out in the ground. That's my principle. Last year and this year for Senkaku Islands, I have conducted a maritime survey. Japanese government understood my point, and I got the support from Japanese government and was able to conduct maritime survey in and around Senkaku. Ishigaki City has been the sponsor. Ishigaki City has been the sponsor, and the Maritime Department of Tokai University formed a team to conduct a survey in maritime area around Senkaku. As Dr. Komori had mentioned, since 2018, Japanese government made a third basic plan on ocean policy and indicated the direction to challenge to become a new maritime country and uphold comprehensive maritime security. Go ahead with territorial water surveillance, assurance of security, disaster measures, and maritime domain awareness, protect and manage remote islands and so forth. The government has to deal with it and integrative action. But Japanese maritime policy is not enough, and one of that is the Senkaku Island issue, which awaits to be resolved. It is a territory. In 1895, Japan's cabinet declared that Senkaku belongs to Japan back in those days in January 14th. But sometimes people claim that as a result of the Japan Sino war, territory was shifted, but even before that, we had clear intention that the Senkaku really belongs to Japan, and 10 years before that, all these islands were uninhabited, and it was annexed with Japan. And it was only Japanese who had settled in Senkaku Islands, and only Japanese have developed Senkaku Islands, and that is the basis for Japan's claim on the Senkaku. So it's like a linchpin of a fan of the East China Sea. That is the geographical location, very important location of Senkaku. To manage that Senkaku means that interests should be upheld for protection because it's very important. Sovereignty has to be protected. And it has a rich ground for hosting the nature, treasure trove of nature. Many species are living, rare species and so forth. Tuna, so fishing ground is located near around the ocean. But China also claims over this area, so that the Japanese government became considerate to China and prohibited people to go into the Senkaku Islands. Because without any conflict, Japan's wish was to control and manage the Senkaku in the first place. However, in the Otorijima and so forth, in the olden days, a goat which had been released by human beings before has become wild. There used to be two, but at one time it grew to 1,000. Now 500 goats are still living on the island, and those goats are having a crop damage, eating all the grasses and crops and so forth, destroying the biosystem. And there is a Senkaku mole, rare species, as well as Senkaku freshwater crab. They are said to be on the verge of extinction or already went extinct. And there is a lighthouse established for aiding the fishery. And there has been a request for constructing lighthouses and so forth, or make an emergency port in time of hurricane and so forth for communication facilities and so forth. Those have been the requests coming from the people, but Wotsurijima lighting house, a very small one, is being managed, only one being managed. Of course, Japanese government upholds the meeting of the SDGs. I told you about the survey I conducted under the sponsorship of Ishigaki City, and the SDG achievement is very important. SDGs target 14 to protect the rich ocean is a concrete target. We are working on the conservation of maritime environment, also a small-scale fishery. So Ishigaki City are trying to protect those. Ishigaki City have administrative area over the Senkaku, and they like to really protect the richness of the ocean, SDG 14, and they are trying to get the fundamental data about the maritime environment, to conduct a study on the maritime resources and the habitation and the plants and so forth using the survey ship. We had conducted the survey in and around the Senkaku area. So sponsor is the Ishigaki City, which is the main principal body of conducting the survey. And there is international law and domestic law, and none of the activities will violate any one of them. It's totally lawful in the survey, and we had to practice that for 2 years. And in doing the survey, there is a Coast Guard of China. In 2023, 4 China Coast Guard ships have appeared nearby and watched us, 2 ships last year as well. And we were under the protection provided by the Japan Coast Guard, so China Coast Guard ships were not able to get close to our ship. So Ishigaki City is a sponsor of the survey. In place of a national government, the local government has come in to conduct the survey and let the world know that they are the ones who are mainly involved in the managing that area, administering the area. And as a result of the survey, that message was transmitted. Japan is the controller and administrator of that area involved in Senkaku, and that was a clear message sent. So using the peaceful method, the message that Japan is really having the administrative control over the Senkaku was able to be transmitted to the rest of the world. We don't like to make this area of a conflict. We are always for using the peaceful measure, and with global understanding, we like to keep the security around the Senkaku Islands. And what is needed to do that? The maritime environmental protection and conservation will be the way. Also, protecting the marine resources will be the major theme under which we have conducted our work. Apart from Senkaku, of course, our focus is placed on other areas as well. We are placed under very challenging situation, like Northern Territory is being occupied by Russia. And also in Sea of Japan, DPRK, time and again, launching missiles against us. So we are for the free and open Indo-Pacific, of course, that is a foundation. And we are cooperating with the United States, Australia, and India, and try to safeguard the safety and security of ocean. And we had already begun our activities. We are the maritime country. We would like to uphold and practice a comprehensive maritime policy and make ourselves literally the maritime country. But the track record is not so large yet, but we would like to live as a maritime nation. So from the comprehensive point of view, we would like to practice maritime security measures. And to start with, we would protect the ocean. That's the first step. So as a core of Asia, Japan would practice what would mean to be a peaceful ocean manager, and we would like to also practice that and to show with our deeds. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Yamada. looking at the international situations around East Asia, it's increasingly challenging. North Korea, East China Sea, South China Sea militarization of China, and Russian threat. Perhaps this is an area, the most dangerous or second dangerous region, and how to address all the challenges that we face in the region was the question.
They used to be actually working for the Whitecaps, Yokosuka Council, Asia-Pacific Studies. Right there, I heard the single back in, he said just back in Meguro right now. Anyway, 8 minutes in Johnson. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you so much. I'm not being heard. I am being heard. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. I actually think that if you don't mind, I'd like to pick up right where Yamada Sensei ended up there. He was talking about Japan being an important maritime country at the center of Asia, and a responsibility towards the oceans in general. And I think that's absolutely correct. I guess I might quibble a bit that I believe that Japan is a maritime nation, and I would argue it's one of the top 3 most important maritime nations in the world. And because of that, I think that it's very useful and appropriate for us to focus away from maritime security and towards maritime governance. And if I could spend a few minutes on what I'm going to tend to spend a few minutes now on what I think that means and how that is a useful organizational principle to march ahead and improve the stability of the oceans, which is what we're here to discuss. So maritime governance is based on 2 ideas, because governance has 2 elements. One is the deliberate establishments of common rules, and the second is the effective enforcements of those rules. Now, I would argue that UNCLOS and other international law have established those common rules, and that I believe that those common rules are pretty much correct. They were based on a wide range of consensus. The countries that maybe we would like to refer to them as the global South played a very powerful role in those deliberations. Several of the articles were essentially drafted by Indonesia. Singapore, where I'm based, played a key role in organizing the Secretariat. And so, the UN, the UNCLOS starts with the United Nations. And it, I think, is one of the biggest achievements of the United Nations. It truly is a global constitution for the oceans. And it's not the only body of international law, but that governs the ocean. But taken together, these are quite effective. Now, the other part of that is it's not just to say that there are common rules, but it's to say, how can these rules be enforced? And unfortunately, fortunately, it is states which under the rules are given the responsibility for enforcement. But unfortunately, there's a range of actors who are seeking to undermine that governance. I think a lot of the conversation today has been about state actors. State actors are increasingly, states themselves are increasingly turning to gray zone tactics to infringe upon the rights of others while ensuring that those activities don't escalate to war, and this undermines good governance of the ocean. I would also argue that non-state actors, terrorists, pirates, smugglers, we don't hear so much about those in Japan because there's fairly good governance around the waters, but they are a global threat, and they do threat Japanese sea lanes, and they do actually, in fact, threaten the good order at sea immediately around Japan. And then finally, and several of the speakers have talked about this, is environmental threats. These pose risks to mariners and to coastal communities. They create the weather phenomena and the accidents that we hear about from time again in the news. And with issues of climate change and more vessels going to sea, these environmental threats are only becoming more dire. So why is there a shortfall? Why do these threats continue to be able to engage in the maritime domain and cause trouble? There's 2 reasons. One is because many states lack capacity, and then the other is because some states misbehave. They either become the sources of poor governance themselves, or they enable the non-state actors, or they contribute to the environmental threats rather than acting in an environmentally responsible way. So I would argue that it's a good thing that we have documents like Japan's basic ocean policy that comprehensively address these issues. And I think it's very useful to address them together as a matter of governance, as opposed to dividing them between environmental action and maritime safety and maritime security and national defense. So if I can be a little more specific about what we could do about this, I believe that the United States and Japan, although I'm based in Singapore, I am an American and I spent many years in Japan with the United States Navy. And I believe that the United States and Japan together can offer maritime governance leadership that will make a huge difference. And where their power is the strongest, Northeast Asia, they'll make the biggest difference. But they can, but those two countries are so important and so vastly significant that their influence can be felt around the world, and they can really help with maritime governance globally. So just some factoids just to point out why I believe the United States and Japan are such important maritime leaders and such important maritime states. So they're I think some of these are well known, some of them less well known. Two of the three world's largest economies. They are the number 2 and 3, and they're also the largest in terms of exporters and exporters, all of those in the top 3. Almost all of that trade goes by sea. The United States Navy and the JMSDF are 2 of the world's most powerful navies. I would put them as 2 of the top 3 most powerful. The US Coast Guard and the Japan Coast Guard are clearly the 2 most influential coast guards. In terms of shipbuilding, Japan buys with South Korea and China every year as the leading shipbuilding nation. And what Japan takes the leadership in is the most sophisticated classes. Although there are very few vessels which are flagged in the US or Japan, they have the 2nd and 4th largest merchant fleets if you count up the value of the ships, which companies registered in their nations own. New York and Tokyo sit alongside London as the centers of gravity for maritime insurance. They're the leading sources of maritime-related official development assistance. Yes, that's true, even in light of all of the news that the Belt and Road Initiative gives. The United States and Japan still give the world a greater degree of maritime development assistance. And then finally, I would point out that on the technology side, stuff that Dr. Watson spoke about, the United States and Japan are clearly the leaders in terms of maritime awareness technology and related activities. So what can these 2 countries do together to make a difference? I think what's really important is that the United States and Japan, I think it would be extremely helpful for the United States and Japan to recognize this position and recognize this responsibility and recognize that there's a role for them as maritime leaders that goes beyond simply naval defense. I think that together they can take this stance and it will influence naval defense, but will also affect all these other areas of the maritime domain, which we need to have a stable order. So specific things they could do is first, I would like to see the US and Japan come together on a bilateral maritime coordination mechanism. This is an agency to agency coordination mechanism that would involve stakeholders outside of the Ministry of Defense and outside of the Department of Defense. It could be led by MOFA and it could be led by the State Department, but we should see commerce and trade, law enforcement, other areas there. And I think that while the government should take the lead, they should include to the greatest extent possible their other stakeholders. So their commercial stakeholders such as the shipping industry, the insurance industry, but also national, local law enforcement, et cetera. Now, does that mean all those people have to be at all of the meetings? No, absolutely not. That'd be ridiculous. But instead, the 2 countries could set up a maritime discussion group or a maritime council or a sequence of meetings and workshops, and then it could filter down. I also think that there should be a bilateral policy approach to improving maritime governance. We just received a whole brief on Japan's basic ocean policy. Is there a United States equivalent? Not that I know of. If there is, it's not very well known because I do this all the time. So I'm sure there's some American who would point out and say, oh no, my little agency over here has X, Y, and Z. But it's not truly a national policy. It very much is an agency policy. There's a few things that might be at the level. So I would say the United States would like to elevate it and have its own basic ocean policy. And for those basic ocean policies to be coordinated as much as possible. They should both, they should go ahead and focus on their own national interests, but they cross-pollinate. And this sets the stage for global leadership and diplomatic coordination. I think that diplomatic coordination can happen in places like the United Nations, but it should also take place in specific maritime venues such as the International Maritime Organization, or here in Asia, the Regional Cooperation Against Asian Piracy Organization, etc. And then I think it's really important that the two countries use that stage of cooperation to engage their partners and engage each partners in the relationship that is most suited to them. For some countries, some partners, that might be the United States and Japan working together in capacity building projects. But in other cases, such as maybe the United Kingdom or France, it might be a better opportunity for Greece, a small country but hugely above, carries a maritime weight which is above that of its economic size, and they can coordinate with those countries to say, what are the common interests and what are the common values that we can bring to improve ocean governance. So I just think, it's maybe a little bit different than some of the other arguments, but I think it does kind of bring it together. I mean, we've been talking about ocean stability, and there's some environmental side there, there's some shipping side there. This brings that, but it also brings this national deterrence. I do think that the process should be should be specifically divergent from the national security and the deterrence prospects and that project. And I also think that the United States and Japan, that project is going quite well. It should be complementary but separate, because if we dilute it and we make it a defense thing, it'll just be overshadowed. But on the other hand, if we separate the two, then good ocean governance is about the principles of following the laws, and those principles will segue into national behaviors writ large. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, John. John delineated several specific the possible policy and countermeasures, especially regarding what we have to do. Thank you, John. The final speaker is Stephen Nagy. He is originally from Canada, but actually I met with him actually this morning in Sydney, Australia. So Nagy-san for 8 to 10 minutes, 8 to 9 minutes, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Ito, Professor Watanabe, and to the Japanese Forum for International Relations. It's a real honor to participate in this forum. Professor Ito asked me to talk about the convergences in Indo-Pacific strategies with regards to the maritime domain. And with that, I'm going to focus on 3 areas building from John's comments. 1 is stability through rules, 2 is governance, and 3 is coordination. And I would like to focus on 3 particular areas. First is traditional security, 2 is non-traditional security, and 3 is resilience. Canada is not a claimant of any of the South China Sea issues, but it looks at the South China Sea and the sea lanes of communication, their management, through the lens of trade. About $5.5 trillion of trade goes through the sea lines of communication annually, according to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Those imports and exports fuel the 2nd, 3rd largest economies, and of course the 10th largest economy, South Korea. And with that, Canada, European Union, as well as individual countries in Europe, all have a stakes in stability within the Indo-Pacific and those maritime sea lanes. And this is where this idea of stability through rules is critically important to ensure that the arteries of trade and energy imports continue to fuel our economies and create stability within the region. The question is, as John mentioned, where do we dedicate our resources in terms of governing? And this is a really complicated issue, but again, I think there's 3 areas of traditional security, non-traditional security, and resilience. And where we see alignment of many countries with their interests in the Indo-Pacific really stems from 3 particular areas. 1, of course, is the rules-based behavior in the maritime domain. 2 is stemming weapons of proliferation on the Korean Peninsula, and here we see governance through sanctions evasion programs with Canada and other countries through operations such as Operation Neon. And we also see strengthening ASEAN intra-regional integration as a key tool to building a code of conduct within the region to help manage the sea lanes. We see growing alignment between Canada and other middle or secondary powers in terms of contributing to monitoring and surveillance activities within the region. They understand, as John mentioned, that it's not just about deterring China. We have to think about piracy, illegal fishing. We have to think about non-state actors as important destabilizers of sea lanes of communication that we also need to focus our efforts. And of course, there's strong concerns about peace and stability across the Taiwan Straits and what a kinetic conflict across the Taiwan Straits would mean for those sea lanes of communication that really provide those critical arteries to bring in imports and exports and energy resources to the region. So we see in terms of governance and coordination that we need to think about not only state actors, but non-state actors, that we need to think about ways to coordinate our activities in terms of gray zone operations, managing lawfare. And I should remind you that in 2021, our Chinese friends adopted a new Coast Guard vessel that allows them to use force. This is very complicated in terms of how we manage their behavior in and around the Senkaku Islands, but also in the islands in and around the South China Sea. In the areas of non-traditional security, which I think are equally important, we need to be thinking about how we can coordinate and govern to stem the challenges of climate change, which could destabilize sea lanes of communication. How do we manage piracy, human trafficking, food security, and human security issues? These will be disruptive forces on sea lanes of communication moving forward, especially as climate change continues to move apace. How do we manage these issues? Will say a lot about the stability of the broader Indo-Pacific region and the maritime domain. By way of example, I encourage you to think about what does it mean for sea lanes of communication and food security as sea levels rise within the region. In particular, the Mekong Delta is an area of particular sensitivity. It's the breadbasket or the rice basket for hundreds of millions of individuals. Without good governance and coordinating policy, as John mentioned, it's going to be an area of instability that will spill over into sea lines of communication. The last area that I think there's a lot of convergence in thinking about is resilience. Resilience in terms of supply chains, resilience in terms of dealing with economic coercion, and resilience in terms of dealing with black swan events like the COVID-19 pandemic. While divorced from directly from the maritime sea lanes, of course, a disruption in maritime sea lanes will affect supply chains and how we bring in goods to our economies. Economic coercion doesn't just happen in terms of trade, but it happens in the maritime domain as well. And of course, black swan events, whether it's a transnational pandemic or a natural disaster such as a tsunami, as we saw in 2005, these have huge possibilities or huge potential negative ramifications in terms of how sea lanes of communication will be managed and how we transport goods through those sea lanes of communication. Resilience, again, is becoming an important area of discussions in terms of Indo-Pacific stakeholders and thinking about how they can bypass or at least create more stability in sea lines of communication. And the maritime part, of course, requires coordination, but we also require coordination in terms of our investment in infrastructure and connectivity to create alternative production zones that can act as alternative centers of production when sea lanes of communication are disrupted. Last thing I think importantly is to focus on Taiwan. Taiwan is the center of many of the challenges within the region. We see increasingly assertive behavior across the Taiwan Straits, and Taiwan plays a critical role, not only in technology, but also in terms of sea lines of communication. How we inculcate stability and through rules into the Indo-Pacific and across the Taiwan Straits. How do we support a status quo? How do we govern the Taiwan Straits are important questions. And as John mentioned, Japan and the United States, of course, are the biggest powers, perhaps in the region aside from China. But what is the role for Canada? What is the role for Germany, France, the Netherlands, and the European in general in stabilizing these sea lines of communication and ensuring that the Taiwan Straits does remain an international waterway? These are key areas of coordination that we need to move forward and think about to ensure that the sea lines of communication that run in and around Taiwan remain stable and rules-based. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, Nagi-san, thank you. Thank you for the very comprehensive actually comments regarding the convergence of the Indo-Pacific strategies. Well, all the 6 speakers have finished the talking. Well, we have about 15 minutes for discussion. For the audience would like to ask questions, also make comments. I think use the system to chat or I think the secretariat office is going to probably appoint you for the question. But in the meantime, I'd like to raise one big question to all of you. Everybody has been saying about the comprehensive kind of actually threat happening in the in the Pacific, and also various kinds of the combination of the how to say countermeasures, including traditional security and also non-traditional. Well, the gray zone is also one of the focal points actually for the Chinese to expand its influences in the Indo-Pacific areas. So I think facing that kind of the various kinds of threat coming from the various parts of the Indo-Pacific areas. Well, the John mentioned about kind of more specific plans of the what the U.S. and Japanese are able to do. But also, I think that's also going beyond the kind of the established framework of international law. Well, I'd like to actually pass the microphone to Dangan regarding the Vietnam's perspective towards South China Sea. And the South China Sea is, of course, right now when facing the mixture of the threats, including a traditional also gray zone security. So I think that from the perspective of Vietnam, what kind of thing that the Vietnam would be able to do. It's not just kind of strengthening the Vietnam's capacity, military capacity, but also probably trying to reach out to the other friends and like-minded countries, and also looking for the various ways of the conducting countermeasures against what the Chinese have been doing. So from the perspective of Vietnam, Rangan, do you have any ideas or comments regarding what kind of how the Vietnam would be able to conduct what kind of countermeasures would the Vietnam is going to to provide so for the stability to the South China Sea? Any comments?
Well, it is really a big question. In the case of Vietnam, I think we still consider ourselves as a small and medium country, and the best weapon for a small country is stick to the rules. So on the one hand, we would like to support the rules-based order. We advocate for good order at sea in general, and also the good order in the South China Sea. But on the other hand, we need to prepare ourselves the capacity that we can defend in the worst scenarios. So building capacity is also a very important pillar in the policy matter. And the capacity is in the broad sense as the capacity in economics, in like technology, in defense. So like it's a comprehensive capacity to address with the new threat and new situations.
Okay, thank you. Well, do you have any questions to the other speakers, by the way? Comments? I hope my voice is okay. Yeah, well, yeah. Well, among the speakers, any questions, comments? Actually, different from among the speakers. I'm just waiting for the audience to get in. So I think that in the meantime, probably what discussion among us will be useful. I think. Yeah, John, go ahead. John, yeah, thank you.
Fantastic. I was wondering if I could ask Komori-san if there's anything he can preview about the 4th basic plan on ocean policy. What's going to be different? I know that you can only say so much, but can you give us some hints? I know people like me are excited to find out.
Thank you for that question. Well, as we speak, I think last week, since 2 weeks ago, some of the elements of the upcoming plan has been reviewed by the press. The first pillar is security, and the second pillar is sustainable oceans. I mean, different press have reported by using different expressions, but environmental conservation and sustainability, ensuring those two. I mean, it seems that these two will be the major pillars of the upcoming plan. Well, since we are here for this forum, there was a discussion on traditional security and non-traditional security. And in the area of oceans, Japan should pursue both traditional and non-traditional securities. And I'm commenting based on what has been reported in the press, but I hope that satisfies your question.
So thank you very much. Maybe I'd like to bring in Virginia and Lanan's their viewpoints, because I think Virginia talked about the growing number of minilateral relationships within the region. I'm interested in thinking about how both of you think about the growing number of minilaterals and the challenges this is for ASEAN's centrality within the region, and how do we work to build more maritime stability and good governance with this contradiction of ASEAN centrality and a growing number of minilateral relationships.
I can go first. I think it doesn't have to be a contradiction. They can work within the ambit of ASEAN. The like-minded nations who have common interests can work with under the heading of ASEAN. And I think looking forward, it would actually end up strengthening the organization if a small group within, like a subset of the organization, but basically works together and cooperate, and therefore instill that, and they have the same interests, right? All these disputants, for example, and it will still justify in a way the centrality of ASEAN if it proves successful in the end. Strength in little numbers, but they are they surround. Speaking of which, the disputants, they surround the South China Sea, and so they're very geographically well placed if they work together. And so I think I don't see the contradiction there, provided they don't go off on their own, so to speak. And but that solves the problem in a way of the consensus trap, all the kinds of negative criticisms that's been directed at ASEAN, the Cambodia not signing and all this, that basically precludes that. If only the countries were involved, the subset of countries involved in the disputes were doing the action on behalf of ASEAN. That's how I would think about it. I don't know about if La agrees to that.
Well, for me, I have to accept that there is some concern about the role of ASEAN and ASEAN centrality when it comes to the blossom of minilateral recently. It also, there's some concern raised whether it's between the two concepts, inclusive and exclusive. So when it comes to inclusive, everyone would feel happy. And when it comes to exclusive, it's where suspicion and concern were raised. But then when it comes to minilateral, you cannot follow the inclusive concept because minilateral is require a lot of flexibility and smaller grouping. So of course there are some concern, but I agree with Virginia that actually there's no contradiction, because if you look at the membership in Quad or AUKUS, for example, they are all dialogue partners of ASEAN. And the way they work, they're very project-based, it's very flexible, and it hasn't ruled out the possibility in the future that they will create a kind of plug-in mechanism that allow ASEAN or some other country to add on or to cooperate on project base. So in that sense, I think gradually, based on the effectiveness of multilateralism and the current model, if it shows its effectiveness, then others will cooperate with each other. And I think Quartz, for example, take quite a long time to prove that it can work with each other among 4 members. And now people thinking of bringing in EU, Canada, South Korea, and other party, Australia, for example, to join in the project raised by Quad, but based on the project base. So that is my idea, I think.
Mm-hmm. Okay, especially the case of the freedom of navigation, can be, at crisis, when the big power is really actually expanding its influence over the, the areas. So I think that one way is of course trying to look for kind of trying to get the consolidation with actually the ASEAN, and also keeping that actually relations good. So I think that's quite significant idea. Well, any others? Any other questions and the comments? I guess that we're just asking that the JFIR secretary regarding kind of the possible the intervention from the audience, and the probably about the right now in Australia I cannot see the the link, and but if you find anybody like an audience who'd like to get into the discussion, let me know. I think Q&A, I found that there's one question from the audience, that's written in Japanese, so I'm actually reading that in Japanese.
With regards to the Vietnamese maritime policies, 20 or so years ago, there was a delimitation in the Gulf of Tonkin between Vietnam and China. And under this agreement, China agreed to the middle line. Under this agreement, China is an island nation owning Hainan Island, and Vietnam is a continental nation in East China Sea. Wait a minute. China argues that in East China Sea, as a continental nation, China argues that continental shelf starts only from the continental side. How would you evaluate this attitude by China?
That's actually trying to translate in English, I think, so I think, what, I hope Lang will be able to understand what I said.
Well, I try my best. So I guess the question is about the position of China towards the continental shelf generated from the mainland as well as from the island. Right. In the case of the Gulf of Tonkin, the island of Hainan is huge. So therefore, no one dispute over the legal regime of Hainan. I think everyone agrees that Hainan will have the continental shelf and the EEZ. So therefore, when it comes to maritime delimitation with Vietnam in the Gulf of Tonkin, we advocate for the international law, the rules that has been applied in state practice in maritime delimitation. And finally, we arrive at the outcome which Vietnam owned 51% of the area of the Gulf, and China owned 49% of the area in the Gulf. When it comes to the East China Sea, I think the question will be very much depend on what island that we are talking about and the legal regime of the island. So in general, under Article 121, Paragraph 2, islands are equal to land, mainland in generating EEZ and continental shelf. But in the same article at paragraph 3, it also provides the situation that rock cannot have EEZ and continental shelf. So we need to consider in specific cases. So for example, if we applied in the South China Sea, then the arbitral ruling state that the Spratly will not have EEZ and continental shelf. So in that case, anyone on the Spratly cannot claim for the EEZ and continental shelf. In other words, the Spratly will not have the overlapping EEZ and continental shelf with the littoral states. So I cannot say more in detail because I don't know which island we are talking about in the East China Sea. But the principle is to apply Article 121 and consider the natural condition of the island and finally decide whether that island have continental shelf or not. It's open for both possibilities.
Okay, Langan, thank you. That actually also Chinese claims also, make the, infringement of actually Chinese, what they claim towards the actually the East China Sea. So that's a big question actually that raised. So the time is actually running out. So I think it seems that there are two questions already came to my attention from the audience. So just reading everything, and the one question is probably for Yamada Sensei, and the other is regarding North Korea. So I think anybody would be able to get in. So I think this is probably the final questions. So final questions. So the first is I think for Yamada Sensei. Well,
This is an anonymous question. Up until 1945, the government of Japan had islands in the South China Sea as its territories. The public opinion of the Japanese government was that since these islands were the territory of the China, it was Japan advanced into these islands as a part of Sino-Japan War. And this public official opinion of the government of Japan back then contravenes with the official position of the government of Japan at the moment. What would be your take? Second question. In relation to the North Korean missile experiments, is it possible for them to ask them to exercise some self-restraint in relation to the freedom of ocean? Next one. When it comes to Spratly Islands, Paracel Islands, China has militarized these islands and have occupied unilaterally these islands. And in Senkaku, they have intruded into territorial waters and they have had confrontations. And other stakeholder related countries are hesitating to act. So through cooperating with the United States, vacant islands should be occupied or militarized by other related countries. Otherwise, China could take all other islands that China has yet to take. So territorial integrity and freedom of navigation related direct questions that we are finally getting. Professor Yamada, would you comment on any of these questions, please?
Thank you. I think the questioner has a big misunderstanding. Back in 1945, until that, for the islands of the South China Sea, Japan was the claimant. And I used to belong to China, but it's not a fact. I think you have a misunderstanding on this. More than anything else, the situation is that each country, Philippines, Vietnam, they have an area where they are administering. And based on the international law, arbitration court had rendered a decision and award, and that award needs to be respected. And the international community, Japan included, has to expect China to behave accordingly. But it's really hard to do it only depending on the words. Therefore, we do need an operation of freedom of navigation, and we have to show by activities in the maritime area.
Thank you.
The two questions actually, one is North Korea, 一つは北朝鮮のことで、もう一つは南シナ海のこと。
So we have a question on North Korea and the other on South China Sea. Any comment, Professor Nagi? You're on mute. Please unmute.
There was two questions that I'd like to address. One is China's position within the region in terms of its assertions, and I think that we need to separate its South China Sea position, its Taiwanese position, and its East China Sea position, and we need to deal with these differently. The Taiwan position, of course, is about sovereignty from the point of view of Beijing, and how we manage that will be managed differently than the South China Sea and the East China Sea. The South China Sea is an international domain. The Permanent Court of Arbitration's position in 2016 rejected all of China's claims in the South China Sea. And as a result, as we manage that particular domain, we need to continue to work with our friends such as Vietnam and others to push forward on international law in terms of managing the South China Sea. On the East China Sea, with regards to the gray zone tactics and lawfare tactics towards Senkaku Islands, we need to continue to find ways to build deterrence and build resilience into our legal claims for our territories. And one way to do that, I think, is for like-minded countries and friends of Japan to continue to transit in and around the Senkaku Islands collectively and communicate to the Japanese and ask for their permissions to counter the lawfare tactics that I think China is pursuing to try and dilute Japan's administrative claims over the East China Sea and the Senkaku Islands. In terms of North Korea and how we can work together in North Korea to push back against its missile testing, again, the Operation Neon is meant to contribute to sanctions invasions. We need to also enhance our cooperation in that region to enhance our domain awareness to get a better understanding of what North Korea is doing in terms of its missile placements, where it's testing, and how we can create deterrence capabilities through cooperation in the region. I'll stop there. Thank you.
The time is mostly running out already. We passed the 10 minutes. So I'd like to close the session by saying one or two actual things from my side. One thing I'd like to emphasize that the older speakers have been telling about different the different the source of the power and also influence over the ocean areas. The Mr. Komori mentioned about the rising attention to the ideas of the kind of military and also force part of the Japanese the ocean platform, and also Professor Yamada mentioned about the importance and the sovereignty of the Senkaku areas. And the John Bradford mentioned about specific countermeasures, special cooperation between the U.S. and Japan in order for us to maintain the status quo of the freedom of navigation, and also the possible deterrence against the change in the status quo by force. And Nagi-san also mentioned about the convergence of the Indo-Pacific strategies. Of course, the different countries have been right now announcing the different kinds of the Indo-Pacific strategies. But of course, there have been lots of common and also ideas that actually duplicates with the other countries. So I think that Nagi-san's ideas of convergence and also kind of finding out converging areas of the Indo-Pacific strategies among different countries is a good actually point. We have to think about the maintenance of the stability in the oceans. In that context, it's not just about maritime security, but also the entire and also wider conceptions about the Indo-Pacific strategies in order for us to maintain the stability of that region as a whole. And also, Langham mentioned about the different interpretations of the sovereignty that actually expands to the that actually leading to the possible conflict because of the different interpretations and ideas of the different countries. So that projection of the domestic ideas in the national arena has been a traditional and also the perennial the source of the problems among the countries. And Virginia mentioned about different kinds of multilateralism, 2 and 3, and also 5, about the different kinds of multilateralism. Well, we have to actually think about the how we able to create and maintain the coalition of willings. It's not just US and Japan, but also we're trying to include wider number of the countries in order for us to they conduct countermeasures against the change in the status quo. And also Virginia emphasized the importance of technologies. And technology is also trying to, the kind of technology for the, monitoring surveillance of the oceans, and even the case of the global, the usage of the, for the global, issues, how the actually one country has been making use of the technology, not just for the public use, but rather actually for the, interests of the, one country and its own country. Is the thing that we have to avoid. So I think that the getting these different kinds of opinions together, I actually like to emphasize that how we have to actually combine the different kinds of the powers and the influence, the countermeasures against the change in the status quo. So I think that this is one of the issues we have to continue to talk, and I would like to actually wind up and finish this in the symposium. Of course, for freedom of navigation is of course the main idea is the how to make use regarding the kind of usage of the oceans. But usually, security is the idea that one country is actually trying to expand to a what area. This is actually a conception of the properties of ocean. Usually, the UNCLOS has been trying to emphasize the usage of oceans, but actually coastal countries has been trying to emphasize the property part of oceans. Well, of course, the UNCLOS is kind of compromise the production between the different ideas. But as the globalization continues, the oceans have really becoming one of the quite significant point for the supply chain and also various kinds of transport. Without smooth usage of that actual transportation, our the society cannot survive. So I think that in winding up this conference, I'd like to say that the usage of these different kinds of powers influence would become more significant, and we have to think about the more specific usage of these influences. In that sense, we can say that we are able to think about it's not just international law, but also something beyond that, and the more specific countermeasures against the powers that have been trying to change the status quo by force. So I would like to emphasize, thank you very much actually for the speakers and also audience, and I would like to finish the conference. Regarding questionnaires, that the audience is about to get, please, give us any questions, also comments, also not just about this conference, but also for the possible, upcoming conference that we are going to organize. And also, 6 speakers, thank you very much for the active participation of any contributions to the conference. And of course, the ocean security and this maritime security has become more significant as the time goes by. So we actually would like to get back to the similar kind of conferences and trying to exchange opinions. Thank you very much, and I'd like to close the conference and goodbye until the I see you actually next time. Thank you.